Most women think silence is weakness, until they learn it is the most magnetic force they possess. In the stillness of her lips, in the refusal to feed the chaos with words, a woman becomes something that no man can control. Silence is not absence, it is a field, an atmosphere, an unseen gravity that draws the unready into confusion and the worthy into revelation. Carl Jung knew that the unspoken carries more weight than the spoken, that in the void, the unconscious of both man and woman speaks its truest language. When she withdraws her voice, it is not merely that the sound disappears. It is the signal to a shadow that the game has changed. The man who was once confident in his grasp suddenly feels the ground beneath him shift. He does not understand why the warmth of her attention has turned into a cool, impenetrable distance. He does not yet realize that in her stillness she is not waiting, she is transforming. The silence is not punishment. It is the alchemy of self minus respect. A woman who chooses silence is not empty. She is full of herself, of the power she has reclaimed from the places she once gave it away to freely. She no longer explains, no longer defends, no longer bargains for a place in a man's heart. Her quiet is the gate through which only those with true intention may pass. The rest will fall away, and done by their own restlessness. In Jungian terms, this moment is the withdrawal of projection. She takes back every fragment of her identity. She once hung on him like ornaments, reclaiming the pieces of her own soul from the hooks of his approval. The animal within her stands taller, no longer a fragile reflection but a source of deep inward fire. And he now confronted with her absence begins to meet his own shadow. For the man, her silence is unbearable because it mirrors his inner void. Without her constant reassurance, he must hear the hollow echoes inside himself. This is where attraction transforms into obsession, not because she manipulates, but because she refuses to be consumed. The male ego, accustomed to control, begins to crack under the weight of her non-minus response. In that fracture, he feels both fear and longing. Silence exposes truth. It shows him whether his desire was rooted in love or merely in conquest. For many, it is the latter, and they will retreat, unable to stand in the presence of a woman who no longer plays their game. But for the rare few, her silence becomes a mirror that awakens something dormant. They feel the pull, not of her body alone, but of her untouchable essence. You may think that saying nothing will make you invisible. In reality, it makes you unforgettable. Every word left unsaid becomes a question that haunts him. Every day without your voice becomes an arena where his mind wrestles with your absence. It is in that gap between what was and what is that your gravity forms. He can leave your presence, but not your silence. The Stoics understood this power well. Seneca spoke of the strength found in not reacting, Marcus Aurelius of the mastery in self-minus command. A woman's silence, when born from inner, knowing rather than fear, is this mastery incarnate. It is the discipline to let the storm pass without being pulled into its winds. It is the ability to hold your own ground while the other loses theirs. Yet, the silence is not cold cruelty. It is the warm, steady flame of self-minus possession. It does not seek to hurt, but neither will it rescue a man from the lessons he must face alone. Jung taught that what we do not make conscious will rule our lives, and we will call it fate. In your silence, you are forcing his unconscious to the surface. Whether he confronts it or runs from it, that is his journey, not yours. Some will accuse you of arrogance, of emotional games, of being heartless. But those accusations are nothing more than the voice of their own discomfort echoing back at them. They cannot bear that you are no longer feeding their ego. Your silence starves the false, and the false always howls when it is dying. And so you sit in the quiet, not as a beggar waiting to be chosen, but as a queen already seated on her throne. The world may not understand it, but he will feel it the way the air changes around you, the way his thoughts keep circling back, the way his heartbeat quickens in your absence. This is not magic. This is the raw, ancient psychology of the feminine in her power. In the absence of her words, a strange inversion occurs. The man begins to speak to himself. At first, it is with irritation, a restless need to fill the silence with explanations and self-minus justifications. But as the days stretch on, irritation turns to unease to curiosity, and curiosity to longing. The more he seeks her voice, the more he confronts the hollow ring of his own. He finds that without her responses, his statements echo back like unanswered prayers. Carl Jung understood this pull as a psychic tension, a force that compels consciousness to resolve what feels incomplete. In her silence, she leaves the picture unfinished, the narrative suspended. This is where the masculine mind becomes entangled, pacing endlessly in the prison of its own thoughts. He may replay every last conversation, dissecting each glance, each pause, trying to find where he lost her. He does not see that she is no longer even in the same room, no longer even playing the same game. What most men cannot grasp is that this silence was not born in a single moment. It is the culmination of many small betrayals, not always cruel, but each cutting away at the roots of her patience. The final quiet is not an act of sudden rebellion, but the slow awakening of a woman who has remembered herself. It is the reclamation of her energy from the endless drain of explanation, negotiation, and tolerance. This kind of silence carries weight because it is not merely the absence of noise, it is the presence of conviction. A woman who has arrived here has already faced her own shadow. She has met the parts of herself that feared abandonment, the parts that begged for crumbs of affection, the parts that mistook attention for love. She has held them, soothed them, and told them the truth. She will not live at the mercy of someone else's willingness to value her. You too may have felt the tremor of this transformation within yourself. The moment when your instinct told you to explain one last time and you didn't. The instant when your heart wanted to rush after him and your feet stayed planted. That is the moment you stepped out of the archetype of the pleasurant into the role of the sovereign. The male psyche, when confronted with such sovereignty, is forced into an uncomfortable reckoning. Many will mistake this reckoning for rejection and flee into the arms of distraction. Others will lash out, trying to provoke you into breaking your composure, because if you speak, if you react, they can believe they still have power. But the man who can sit with your silence, who can examine his own discomfort without trying to silence yours, is rare. He is the one who may meet you at the threshold of mutual respect. From a Jungian perspective, her silence is the withdrawal of psychic energy from the projection she once placed upon him. Before, she may have seen him through the lens of her unmet needs, her idealizations, her longing for completion. Now, she sees him as he is no larger than life, no smaller than truth. This collapse of projection is devastating to the male ego that thrived on her admiration. But it is liberating for her. Men are drawn to this shift because it cannot be faked. A silence rooted in resentment feels brittle, breakable. But a silence rooted in deep self-minus possession feels infinite. It is the kind of quiet that makes a man question everything he thought he knew about connection. He cannot place it, but he feels that she is no longer orbiting him. She has become the center of her own gravity, and now he is the one drawn into her pull. Even the Stoics would nod in recognition here. Epictetus taught that we cannot control the actions of others, only our own. To choose silence is to remove yourself from the battlefield where words are weapons and emotions are bait. It is to let the other exhaust themselves in shadow-minus boxing while you stand untouched. The silence becomes not a wall, but a mirror showing him exactly where his strength ends and his fear begins. This is why silence can feel like abandonment to the unprepared man. In truth, it is an invitation not to chase her back into noise, but to meet her in the stillness. To understand that love is not sustained by possession, but by presence. To realize that her value does not diminish in the quiet. It expands, becoming something far greater than he can hold. And so her quiet becomes the most irresistible gravity. Not because it promises to return to him, but because it doesn't have to. In the depths of that realization, he begins to see her not as an extension of his story, but as the author of her own. And that, more than anything, is what he cannot forget. There comes a moment when the silence stops being a reaction and becomes a presence of living, breathing force that reshapes the entire dynamic. She is no longer withholding words as a tactic. She is simply dwelling in a state where they are no longer required. And this shift, imperceptible to the untrained eye, is the very reason her gravity grows. It is no longer about him. It is about the field she carries around her, the sovereignty of a woman who has taken back her psychic energy and refuses to let it leak into unworthy hands. Carl Jung might say she has stepped into individuation, the process of becoming whole unto herself. Before, her identity may have been entangled with the way he saw her, the way he responded, the way he validated her worth. Now she has entered a territory where those external cues have lost their hold. She has moved her seat from the gallery of his approval to the throne of her own inner kingdom. To a man accustomed to her constant emotional availability, this is disorienting. He had grown comfortable in the idea that her affection was a given, that her laughter, her warmth, her empathy would always be there to soothe the rough edges of his world. But now he finds himself standing outside the gates, wondering how they closed without his noticing. He begins to realize that what he thought was his dominion was, in fact, her gift, and that gift is no longer freely given. Silence becomes a test he did not know he was taking. The man who approaches it with arrogance will try to break it, to force her back into the old rhythm where he had the advantage. But the man who approaches it with humility will begin to see the truth. Her silence is not an enemy to be defeated, but a terrain to be understood. It is in this understanding that his own growth begins. And yet, this silence is not a wall of ice. The untrained might mistake it for coldness, but it is closer to the quiet of a sacred temple. Words can be spoken there, yes, but only those worthy of the echo. She has learned that not every man, not every situation, not every demand deserves her voice. The sacred cannot be shared indiscriminately without losing its power. You, as a woman walking this path, may feel the initial tremors of resistance in your own body. The old patterns whisper, speak, so they understand you. Explain, so they won't misjudge you. Answer, so you don't lose them. But you do not obey. You stay in the stillness long enough for those voices to lose their authority. You begin to see that those impulses were not signs of love, but signs of fear of being misunderstood, fear of being left behind. Jung often spoke of the necessity of confronting one's shadow, and this silence is part of that confrontation. In choosing not to fill the space with justifications, you allow the other to sit with their own discomfort. You resist the urge to rescue them from the mirror you are holding up. This is not cruelty. It is clarity. It says, I will not distort my truth to protect your illusions. Men feel this clarity even if they cannot name it. Some will run from it, unsettled by the way it makes their usual strategies useless. Others will linger, circling, sensing that what they are drawn to is not just your beauty, but the way your boundaries have become an unspoken language. You no longer need to say no aloud. It is in the way you hold yourself, in the way you do not rush to fill every gap with approval. The Stoics would see this as a form of inner citadel, a fortress built, not from stone, but from self minus command. Marcus Aurelius wrote of standing like a rock in the sea, unmoved by the wave. This is what your silence has become, a steady, grounded presence in a world obsessed with noise. You do not fight the tide. You simply remain unshaken as it rises and falls around you. And the irony is this: the more you remain unmoved, the more others will move toward you. It is not because you are playing hard to get. It is because you are no longer playing at all. You are simply being, and that authenticity is intoxicating. It is rare in a world where so many bend themselves into shapes they believe will be liked. This is why your silence becomes irresistible gravity. It is not chasing, It is not pulling, it is not performing. It is simply the natural force of someone who has chosen themselves completely. And whether he admits it or not, he will feel it every time he remembers you, the woman who no longer spoke, yet said everything. In the chambers of her silence, a man begins to encounter something far more formidable than her words. He meets his own reflection, stripped of flattery and stripped of distraction. It is here that the invisible battle unfolds, one not fought with arguments or accusations, but with the steady weight of her absence. The absence is not a void. It is a presence so dense that it bends the space around it, reshaping the orbit of anyone who once took her for granted. Carl Jung would call this the withdrawal of the anima projection, the moment when the idealized feminine image he had unconsciously draped over her vanishes, revealing the reality he must now face. It is a confrontation with truth. She was never merely a character in his story. She was always a sovereign entity in her own. The shattering of this illusion is not gentle. It forces him to either step into his own individuation or retreat into the safety of denial. For the man who has built his self minus image upon control, her silence is a fracture line running straight through his confidence. The part of him that thrived on her constant emotional availability now finds itself starving. He may try to provoke her, to elicit even a flicker of reaction, because any reaction means she is still tethered to him. But she no longer plays in that arena. Her stillness is not passive. It is an active dismantling of every invisible string that once pulled her toward him. And here lies the quiet paradox: the more she withdraws her energy, the more acutely he feels her presence. The human mind is not wired to forget what is unresolved. Without closure, without her final words to box up the relationship neatly, she remains an open loop in his psyche. He thinks of her while driving, in the quiet moments before sleep, in conversations where her name is never mentioned but her shadow lingers. She has become a question that his mind cannot stop asking. Silence, when rooted in self minus possession, is not a wall to keep the world out. It is a filter that lets only the worthy in. And worthiness here is not about his charm, his persistence, or his declarations. It is about whether he can meet her in that silence without collapsing under the weight of his own reflection. It is about whether he can sit in the discomfort of her boundaries and still choose to approach without force. You too may feel the urge to break this silence, to reach out just once more. The compulsion may whisper that a single message, a single explanation will make things easier. But understand this: ease is not what you are after. You are after truth. And truth is not always soft. Sometimes it is forged in the furnace of restraint. The great Stoic Epictetus warned that we lose ourselves when we allow our peace to be dependent on another's behavior. Your silence is the embodiment of this wisdom. It says, "I will not hand you the keys to my inner stability. You may knock, but I will answer only if you come in peace." This is not cruelty. It is the discipline of someone who understands the cost of emotional self minus betrayal. Men who cannot withstand this energy will invent stories to explain it away. They will call you cold, difficult, unfeeling. They will frame your detachment as a flaw because their ego cannot survive admitting it is a mirror. Let them. The ones who are meant to understand will not be repelled by the absence of noise. They will be drawn to the depth beneath it. Over time, your silence begins to carry its own reputation. Those who knew you before may be startled by the change, the way you no longer rush to smooth the rough edges of conflict, the way you no longer bend to make others comfortable. They may feel the shift in the air around you, the gravitational pull of someone who lives by her own inner rhythm. And for the man at the center of this reckoning, the lesson is unavoidable attraction is not sustained by possession, but by respect. Desire is not deepened by constant access, but by the recognition of value. Your silence teaches this without a single lecture, without a single accusation. It allows him to arrive at the truth himself or to walk away, still haunted by the woman who spoke volumes without speaking at all. This is the kind of gravity that cannot be imitated, because it does not come from performance. It comes from the quiet certainty of knowing who you are when you are no longer seeking to be chosen. It is the presence of a woman who has chosen herself and in doing so has become impossible to forget. There is a moment subtle, almost imperceptible when her silence stops being about him entirely. It is no longer a reaction to what he did or didn't do. It becomes the natural state of someone who has reclaimed her own rhythm, her own breathing, her own pulse. She has crossed an invisible threshold where his presence or absence no longer disrupts her center. And in that crossing, she becomes what Jung might call an integrated archetype, a woman, no longer split between the longing for validation and the fear of loss. From this place, her silence changes texture. It is not the brittle stillness of suppressed emotion. It is the rich, steady quiet of someone who no longer needs to prove or persuade. She does not wield it as a weapon. She wears it as a crown. The feminine, when fully realized, does not chase approval. It draws the world and through the sheer force of itself minus containment. And this is what terrifies and fascinates the masculine psyche in equal measure. For the man unprepared to meet this kind of woman, the silence is an abyss. It swallows the familiar patterns where his charm or authority once worked without fail. He may test the boundaries, sending small signals, hoping to coax her back into orbit. But her gravity has shifted. She is no longer circling him. He is now the one adjusting his path, measuring his steps against the magnetic field she unconsciously radiates. The reason this shift is so potent is that it cannot be faked. There is no script for true detachment, no shortcut to this kind of presence. It is born from the slow and often painful dismantling of illusions both about him and about herself. She has looked at the parts of her that once accepted less than she deserved and told them no more. She has faced the shadow of her own need for rescue and learned that the only savior worth waiting for was the one she could become for herself. This inner transformation seeps into every movement, every glance, every pause. Even in a crowded room, she is an unmoving center. She listens more than she speaks, not because she is timid, but because she understands that words are currency and she spends them only where there is mutual exchange. She can be warm, yes, but her warmth is no longer unconditional. It is earned, not assumed. For the man, this is the most intoxicating aspect of her gravity. He senses perhaps for the first time that her attention is not guaranteed, that her focus is not something to be taken but something to be invited. And in this awareness, his own behavior begins to shift. He becomes more deliberate, more present, more careful with the space between them. The silence, instead of pushing him away, begins to pull him toward a higher version of himself. You may not see the effects immediately. The beauty of this transformation is that its impact often unfolds quietly, without your active participation. The phone may stay silent for days. The conversations may not resume. But somewhere, in the privacy of his own mind, the memory of your composure is working on him. He replays moments the way you didn't flinch when he tried to provoke you, the way you didn't scramble to explain when he misunderstood you, the way you let the air settle instead of filling it with apology. This is where silence intersects with the Stoic ideal. Marcus Aurelius spoke of being like the promontory against which the waves continually break. Your silence is that promontory. It does not block the sea. It simply refuses to be carried away by it. In doing so, it becomes a landmark, something unmovable that others must navigate by. And in the deepest sense, this silence is not about teaching him a lesson. It is about honoring the truth that you no longer need to be in the constant noise of other people's validation. You have found the still water within yourself, and you will not leave it for the sake of someone else's storm. He may return drawn by the pull of what he cannot name, or he may drift away, unable to bear the clarity your silence reflects back at him. Either way, you remain unmoved not in coldness, but in wholeness. For the woman who has learned to let silence speak has no fear of who hears it or who doesn't. Some silences feel like absence. Hers feels like an atmosphere, a field of energy that alters every man who steps into it. This is the alchemy Carl Jung pointed to when he spoke of the animus transformative power. It is not always expressed in laughter, touch, or conversation. Sometimes it is expressed in the refusal to be consumed, in the choice to remain still while the world demands movement. In that stillness, she becomes a mirror to the masculine unconscious, reflecting both its beauty and its chaos. The man who once relied on her constant emotional availability finds himself in foreign territory. His mind, conditioned to anticipate her instant responses, now circles in a restless orbit. He thinks of what he might say to break through, but each attempt dies in his throat. Something about her presence, even in absence, warns him that careless words will not work here. It is as if the door has been closed to casual entry, and the only way in is through a kind of reverence he has not practiced before. This is not a strategy she learned from a book or a trick to manipulate affection. It is the natural result of an inner shift, the kind that occurs when a woman has turned her gaze inward and faced the raw terrain of her own shadow. She has seen the places where she once begged to be seen, the way she abandoned herself to be chosen. And she has chosen differently. This choice is quiet, but it is absolute. From this ground, her silence stakes on a texture that no man can quite define. It is not empty. It is layered with self minus possession, with a subtle challenge that says, if you wish to enter, you must bring something real. The masculine, when unprepared, will retreat here not because he does not want her, but because he senses the cost of entry is the abandonment of his own illusions. You, too, may have stood in this place, the point where you realize you have nothing to prove, nothing to defend. The compulsion to correct his perception, to make him understand, begins to dissolve. You see that his misunderstanding is not your problem to solve. That liberation is not loud, but it is seismic. It is in this moment that your gravity shifts. The energy you once poured outward begins to spiral inward, strengthening you. This is the paradox: the less you reach, the more you draw. Men, sensing a field they cannot control, often mistake it for magic. But it is not magic. It is the psychological magnetism of boundaries held without apology. Even the Stoics, masters of inner sovereignty, would recognize this force. Seneca might remind her that he who is brave is free. Her bravery is not in confrontation but in restraint. In refusing to barter her peace for the temporary comfort of being heard, she aligns with a freedom most people will never taste. For the man who lingers in her orbit, the silence becomes a test of endurance. Can he remain without demanding? Can he approach without the need to dominate? Can he sit in the uncertainty long enough for something deeper to be born? These are the unspoken questions her silence poses. Not all can answer them. Many will turn away, calling her distant, elusive, too difficult. But those words are merely shields against the truth. They are unwilling to meet her at the depth she now requires. Her silence is not the end of the story. It is the filter that determines who may enter the next chapter. And so, while he wonders if she will speak again, she is not waiting. She is building. The woman who embraces her own stillness is never idle. She is expanding, even in apparent inactivity. Every day she spends in that space, her gravity grows stronger. If he returns, it will not be because she called him. It will be because something within him could not forget the feel of her absence. And if he does not, it will not be her loss. For she has learned that the silence that once felt like loneliness is in truth the sound of her own power. There is a peculiar phenomenon in the male psyche when faced with the kind of silence that does not beg to be broken. At first it feels like defiance, a wall raised in resistance. But with time, it begins to feel like a mystery, a puzzle with no clear edges, a story that refuses its final chapter. And the human mind is not built to leave such mysteries alone. The more he tries to move on without solving it, the more it lingers, whispering to him in moments of quiet. Carl Jung would describe this as the tension of opposites, the unbearable space between what the conscious mind wants to dismiss and what the unconscious refuses to release. Her silence, rich with unspoken meaning, occupies that space like a slow-minus burning ember. It does not consume him all at once. It works more insidiously, slipping into the gaps between his distractions, resurfacing in dreams and memories, in the subtle ways certain places where songs remind him of her. But for her, this is not about haunting him. She does not hold the silence as a blade over his head. It is, instead, a shield one forged in the fire of self-minus reclamation. She has walked through the ache of wanting to explain herself, of wanting to win back understanding, and has emerged on the other side with a truth that needs no audience. This is why the gravity grows, not because she withholds, but because she no longer needs to give in order to feel whole. In this state, her presence feels different, even when she is gone. If they cross paths again, her gaze will not seek his. Her energy will not lean toward him. She will not shrink to avoid discomfort, nor will she flare to provoke it. She will stand as she is centered, balanced, neither inviting nor rejecting, simply existing in her own field. And that, for a man accustomed to measuring his worth by the reactions he can provoke, is both disarming and magnetic. You may have felt this yourself that moment when you realized you no longer feared what would happen if you did nothing. The anxiety that once pushed you to speak, to text, to explain melts into a calm acceptance. It is not indifference. It is mastery. You have learned that the connection worth keeping will never need to be chased, and the one that dies without pursuit was never meant to last. The Stoics would see in this the highest form of discipline, the refusal to be ruled by impulse. Epictetus taught that freedom comes when we cease to crave what is not within our control. By holding your silence, you are not trying to manipulate the outcome. You are simply acknowledging that the outcome was never yours to control. And yet, men feel the pull of this silence precisely because it does not demand. It allows them to project their own meaning onto it, to imagine what might be hidden beneath. Some will imagine resentment, others longing, others in untouchable peace. Whatever they imagine, they cannot erase the fact that it exists a presence in their mental landscape they did not consent to but cannot remove. Over time, the truth becomes clear. Her silence has become its own language. It says, "I will not trade my peace for your attention." It says, "I am not a reflection of your desire, but a whole world unto myself." It says, "If you wish to meet me, you will have to come with something deeper than words." For the rare man who can understand this, the silence is not a barrier but a threshold. He will approach with care, aware that the wrong step will close the door again. He will not demand her voice, but will earn it, not through persistence alone, but through presence, the kind of steady, unshaken presence that can stand beside hers without trying to overshadow it. And if such a man never comes, she will not grieve the empty space. For she knows that in filling her life with her own voice, her own passions, her own chosen people, she has already built the gravity that will draw only what belongs. Some women break their silence to be heard. She keeps hers to be understood not by him, but by herself. In the stillness, she hears the voice beneath all other voices, the one that does not speak in panic or longing, the one that does not bargain or plead. It is the voice of her own center, the steady pulse that existed long before he arrived and will continue long after he is gone. This is the silence that Carl Jung might call the homecoming, the moment when the fragmented self returns to wholeness. For the man, this is the most dangerous form of feminine power, because it is untouchable. It cannot be seduced back into need, cannot be baited into reaction. The ego, which thrives on dominance and control, has nothing to grasp. He may call it detachment, coldness, even cruelty, but these are projections born of frustration. What he truly feels is the disarming weight of her self-minus possession. Silence like this does not shrink in the presence of noise. It deepens. He can speak louder, faster, more desperately, but it will not pull her from her ground. The more he tries to stir the waters, the more he is confronted with his own reflection in their stillness. And this is where the pull becomes irresistible, not because she is chasing, but because she is unmoved. Men are drawn to that which will not bend for them, especially when they are accustomed to the world yielding easily. This is why Jung's concept of the shadow becomes so relevant here. In her silence, she forces him to meet the parts of himself he has kept hidden: his insecurity, his fear of abandonment, his dependency on validation. He may resist, deflect, or attempt to reverse the dynamic, but the truth remains: her absence has illuminated his inner emptiness more clearly than her presence ever could. For her, the silence has shifted from an act of protection to a state of being. It is not simply about keeping him at bay. It is about creating the conditions in which she can continue her own growth. In this space, she tends to the inner life that once took second place to the demands of connection. She invests in her work, her art, her body, her spirit. She rebuilds her life so thoroughly that it no longer depends on whether he is in it. You might think that this kind of power isolates her, but it does the opposite. It draws into her orbit only those who can match her depth. It filters out the shallow, the opportunistic, the weakly curious. It ensures that those who remain are not there because they want to consume her energy, but because they respect its source. And yet, her gravity is not hard minus-edged. It is not the brittle shell of someone who has been hurt and refuses to trust again. It is a living, breathing strength that welcomes without clinging, that receives without grasping. When she does speak, her words land with more weight because they are not scattered carelessly. When she does open her presence to someone, it feels deliberate, intentional, chosen. The Stoics knew this power well. Marcus Aurelius wrote that nothing is so strengthening as remaining true to oneself in the face of external pressure. Her silence is the embodiment of that principle. It is not a refusal born of pride, but an affirmation born of clarity. I will not abandon myself to hold on to you. For the man who understands this, her silence is not a closed door but a sacred threshold. He learns to approach with patience, to let his own ego quiet enough to meet her where she stands. And if he cannot, the silence will remain not as a punishment, but as a truth. She will not trade her wholeness for his comfort. In the end, the gravity of her silence is not measured by who returns, but by how deeply she has rooted into herself. It is the calm knowledge that she does not need to be chosen to be valuable. It is the freedom that comes from knowing she has already chosen herself. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.